Howdy, folks, and welcome to the Daily Coin. My name is Rory, and today is Thursday, January 26th, 2017, and I have the great honor and very distinct pleasure of welcoming back to the show Mr. John Rubino from DollarCollapse.com. John, welcome back.
Hey, Rory, good to talk to you again.
Well, I'm certainly glad you're here, and we have a lot of ground to cover, so we're just going to jump right in.
Okay.
Zero Hedge had published a few days ago that article about 80% of the central banks planning on getting into the equities market, which is a terrifying idea, in my opinion. And this is from that article, and it says, the bad news is that as more people realize that a free, quote, market now only exists in textbooks and that Soviet-style central planning is the only game in town, confidence in price formation will evaporate, in turn pushing even more market participants out of the quote-unquote market until only central banks are left bidding on each other's otherwise worthless stock certificates. Now, if the central banks are in there purchasing directly all of these stocks, which there are some people that believe, and you may be one of them, that they've been doing this for quite some time. And the comment, you had made the comment about gold and silver, and more specifically about silver becoming even a better investment in light of this. And what I would like, John, is for you to kind of expand on that and share with us your thoughts on silver in relation to what's happening with the central banks making these equities purchases.
Sure. Okay, there's a lot of ground to cover here because we have to set up the background that explains how we ended up with central banks buying equities. Because it wasn't so long ago, I'm talking maybe a decade and a half, that the Federal Reserve's job was to set short-term interest rates. And that was basically it. It controlled the federal funds rate, which in turn controlled bank lending to an extent. And so that was its policy lever. But during the past 30 years, the Fed, mostly under Alan Greenspan, allowed so much new debt to be created and allowed the system to become so highly leveraged that it became so fragile that any kind of a crisis became an existential crisis. So the Fed was left needing to bail out pretty much everybody in sight. Every time there was trouble, they had to intervene in some big way. And that incented the financial system to take on even more debt because the Greenspan put, quote unquote, came to be perceived as explicit public policy. Specifically, if there's any kind of trouble in any major financial sector anywhere in the world, the Fed was going to intervene, bail out the guys who made the bad loans, and basically socialize losses while privatizing profits. So the system under that kind of a Fed regime has gotten more and more leveraged, and every crisis has gotten bigger and bigger, requiring more action by the Federal Reserve that is brand new, stuff that it didn't used to do. So they originally began with QE, where they started buying bonds as a way to control longer-term interest rates, which is a new thing for them. And that prevented a 1930s-style depression, but at the cost of huge amounts of new debt being taken on. Same thing in Japan, same thing in Europe. And it forced some of the central banks out there, specifically Switzerland and Japan, who had bought up all their bonds. There were no bonds left to buy, so they had to shift to something else if they wanted to pump currency into the system. And they started buying equities. So you've got the Japanese central bank now as one of the largest shareholders in a long list of Japanese blue chips. And you got the Swiss central bank a big shareholder in international blue chips like Apple and Facebook. So these guys are like hedge funds now. They're major players in the equity markets. And the Fed and the European Central Bank are kind of being pushed in the same direction. Janet Yellen, the chair of the Fed, is making speeches where she says, wouldn't it be nice to be able to intervene in markets that have a more direct impact on spending decisions? In other words, she wants to start buying equities.
Right.
And a lot of economists are telling the ECB, the European Central Bank, that they need to start doing the same thing. And the reason for that is because old style monetary policy has totally stopped working. It's been taken to its limit. And new age monetary policy, like quantitative easing, is reaching its limit. You can't push interest rates down much below zero if you want the system to work. You can't buy up all the high grade bonds in a system if you want the bond markets to work. And so they're moving on to the next available asset class, which is equities. And what's clear in this process is that the guys doing this don't understand what markets are or how they work, because markets are basically price signaling mechanisms that tell people with capital where to put that capital efficiently. Right. When a stock is going up, that means that business model is perceived to be working and to be creating new wealth. So it tells people with capital to invest that, hey, maybe this kind of thing is a good thing to do with my capital. And vice versa, when a price is going down of a company, it says that this thing isn't working for some reason, so don't put any more money over here. Well, with central banks buying stocks indiscriminately, because what they do is they basically go in and buy, their national equivalent of the S&P 500 with equal amounts or market cap weighted amounts thrown at each stock. And what that does is it makes every stock go up about an equal amount, other things being equal, but based on Fed buying. And therefore, the markets stop sending signals about what works and what doesn't work, because you got this gigantic buyer in there that's pushing everything up kind of simultaneously. So markets then stop working as capital allocators, and capital doesn't know where to go. So it kind of goes in random directions because everything seems pretty hot right now. So just invest in anything, So you get the movement towards indexing, for instance, where people, instead of buying actively managed portfolios that might go up because the stocks in there are, at least in theory, the best stocks to own, you just buy across the board equities via some kind of an ETF, and you get exposure to the market, but you don't generate alpha in hedge fund terms. You don't make anything above and beyond what the market is going to make. So the important thing to understand about this is that the thing that separates today's world from the world of 10,000 years ago is markets. That's the only thing that has allowed all these people to be born and fed, and all the new stuff that is going on right now. All the wealth that's being created by new technologies and everything come from markets. And all the political freedom that we enjoy now comes from a market-based economy throwing off enough wealth to finance a big middle class, which then demands basic freedom for everybody. So the world that we know and take for granted is a market-based world. And if you screw that up, then we might as well be ancient Egypt or the Roman Empire or medieval Europe or something like that. That's the only level of wealth creation that we'll be able to manage. And we're headed that way. And this is terrifying on a lot of levels. One more level where it's terrifying is that as governments acquire more and more of equities of the private sector, their ownership stakes in big companies grows commensurately.
Right.
And that means they have control over these companies at some point. So we end up with some kind of an industrial policy where governments are able, if they want to direct the activities of corporations. And they're going to want to.
Yes.
That kind of power will always be used when it's available. Imagine President Trump waking up some morning and finding out he's a majority owner of General Motors and Boeing. Guess what? He's going to tell them to do a lot of things that they might not do otherwise if they're just efficiently allocating capital. Or, let a democratically controlled Congress find out it's in control of most of the companies of the S&P 500. And all of a sudden, every congressman's going to get a big new factory in his district. Stuff like that will happen. And
Right.
again, growth grinds to a halt when that happens. That's what Europe tried post World War II, where they basically nationalized a bunch of industries, and it was a catastrophe.
And isn't that exactly what this has the potential of doing, is nationalizing certain companies and other companies completely falling out of the mix. So if we've got the central banks, they're buying all the big box store stock. That means that every single mom and pop store that's left at this point will absolutely vanish because they won't have any funds whatsoever. And even within the equity so called market itself, you would have major winners and the rest losers. Or am I wrong in thinking that? I mean, you're only going to have the FANGs, the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple, all of these guys are going to be the winners. Everybody else, loser. Sorry for your bad luck.
Well, yeah, if governments start buying equities, or continue to buy equities, what they do is they buy the biggest stocks. Obviously, they're not
Right.
going to buy tiny little microcap growth stocks. They're going to buy the S&P 500, which advantages the big companies. It raises their value relative to the little guys and allows the big companies to do a lot of bad things. It lets a big
Yes.
company roll up its industry by buying up the smaller competitors because the big company's stock is relatively more valuable. So it gives it the ability to basically take over its industry. So you end up with a bunch of giant companies running pretty much everything, and not much room for startups and mom and pops and things like that. So you don't have dynamism in the economy anymore when you have these big lumbering monstrosities running everything. Because really the fun and dynamic aspect of a modern economy takes place in garages to begin with. That's
Yes.
where the really interesting stuff happens, and then they become the Googles of the world, and then a bunch of new garage-based companies have to start to take on the Googles and the Microsofts of the world. Well, if you short circuit that process by throwing a ton of public capital at the biggest companies in the world, you get pretty much another version of the paralyzing of the price signaling mechanism of markets. So yeah, this is terrible from a lot of different points of view.
And then
But
also, excuse me, John, but
sure.
don't you also get a de facto Trans-Pacific partnership, because who else is left? I mean, now the major corporations, they're all fat and sassy, and they begin dictating how things are going to be. Well, we're going to force you to use this Microsoft X product. We're going to force you to use this Apple X product. We're going to force you to do exactly what we want. And if you don't like it, sorry for your bad luck. I mean, isn't that really kind of
Yeah,
the direction that it would head?
it is. And if you want a real world example of how that works, look at the banking sector in the US.
Exactly.
Starting about 20 years ago, we basically told the big banks they're too big to fail, and we'll always bail them out. And that de facto government guarantee raised their market value relative to that of small banks. And so the big guys just basically rolled up the industry, and you got the mortgage market in the US, for instance, dominated by 5 or 6 banks. And so we live under a, a government that's kind of sort of by JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs and for JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs already. So we're seeing that in the financial sector. And to an extent, that's true in a lot of other areas because we've allowed a lot of big oligopolies to form over the years. But this would turbocharge it. If
Yes.
we started buying the S&P 500 with newly created currency, brought into existence out of thin air by the Fed, then we would basically be handing these guys unlimited credit cards and allowing them to do anything they want to. So yeah, if we want to live under the rulership of Microsoft and Google and Walmart and Monsanto and Exxon, that we're headed that way now. And the idea that it's okay for a central bank to buy up most of the equities in a market is pretty much the guarantee that we'll end up there.
And is it even necessary for the Federal Reserve or any central bank to purchase these equities or bonds or anything else when all they have to do legally is just print money and hand it out? They don't have to actually buy anything. I mean, they can literally just turn the printing press on and start printing dollars, start printing yen, start printing euros, and do with them whatever they wish. I mean, and isn't this really kind of just a backdoor way of taking over everything?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what we already do in the government bond market. For instance, the government borrows money in order to fund itself
Right.
and sends bonds out into the market. Then the Fed creates a bunch of new dollars and buys those bonds back. So, in effect, the Fed is just printing money and tossing it out into the market already. We're already doing that. And I think, it's a combination of inertia. That's the way they've always done it. And this sense that if they do it this way, it's kind of hidden. People don't completely understand that we are just creating new currency and funding the big governments and the big companies of the world with this newly created, made out of thin air currency, because that might be politically hard to explain. But the way we do it now is so convoluted that they don't have to explain it, because nobody really even knows how to ask the question during political campaigns. Did you notice that this wasn't mentioned in the last
Yes.
political campaign? Nobody at the presidential level thought it was worth discussing, or nobody understood it well enough to even think of it as a topic for discussion. I don't know,
I would
but
think
yeah,
that's the case, that they're just not enough intelligence to ask the right question. I mean, these
yeah.
guys proved themselves to not be the sharpest tool in the shed in the first place. I mean, for the most part, the ones that were actually able to get out there and ask questions. I mean, with all their fake news and so forth.
That's why Ron Paul was always so much fun, because he actually asked these questions on a stage with a bunch of other Republicans, and they would laugh at him behind his back. But a significant part of the people watching those debates back then were not laughing at him.
Right.
They were cringing at the way the other Republicans either didn't understand Ron Paul, wondering whether gold was still money or not, and wondering whether the Fed should be allowed to just create money out of thin air. When that was the real question that we should have all been asking. And
Yes.
I would say, Roy, that it's too late now. We are headed off this cliff no matter what we do, and we can accelerate the process by doing stuff like having central banks buy equities and corporate bonds, and after that, there's not much stopping them from buying real estate. They could buy our houses at twice the current market value and stuff like that. That would accelerate the process. But even if they stopped doing crazy stuff right this minute, we still have debt at between 350% of global GDP or 1,100% of global GDP, depending on how you calculate debt. And that's a death sentence for the current financial system, that in and of itself. We've already done the damage. We've already baked the next gigantic financial crisis into the cake. So, the behavior of the government going forward almost doesn't matter, because the system is toast regardless. And it's just a question of what kind of a crisis we end up engineering with our mistakes going forward. We could have a 1930s style depression when all this debt gets wiped out through default, or we could have a Weimar Germany kind of crack up boom hyperinflation where we just print so much new currency that it becomes worthless. Everybody loses faith in it. Those are the only two ways to get rid of debt at this level. You can't grow your way out of it.
And really, that's where gold and silver come into play for you and I and the people that are listening to this. I mean, that's really the only way that we can protect ourselves from either one of those scenarios that you just described, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's
yeah,
it.
because we can vote in elections and we can call our congressmen and we can march on Washington and that's all, it's interesting, civil involvement and everything. It's good stuff to do, but it won't stop what's coming.
Right.
So all we can do, if we can't change the political system and can't change the momentum of the financial system off this cliff that's looming, then all we can do is take care of ourselves and our families.
Well,
And you do that by arranging your finances so that they're not immune necessarily, but they're resistant to the kinds of pressures that we're going to see going forward. The governments of the world are going to have to try to inflate their currencies away. In other words, make their currencies worth a lot less so that their debts are easier to manage. You pay off your debts in full, but you're paying them off with dollars that are worth a half or a third as much as they were when you borrowed them, And that's really the only politically palatable solution that is there for today's and tomorrow's politicians. So you want to get away from that by getting out of national currencies. If you don't own a lot of fiat currency, then you won't be hurt when it drops by 2/3. And so shift your money into older forms of money like gold and silver that can't be created by governments out of thin air. And those things will rise in value much more slowly, rise in supply much more slowly. So they'll hold their value a lot better than fiat currencies will. And that's been true for 3,000 years now. There have been financial crises every year since the days of the Roman Empire somewhere.
Yep.
And in every single one of them, without exception, gold and silver held their value and went way up in local currency terms while those local currencies were being destroyed. So it'll happen again in the same way.
All right.
And silver might actually be better than gold as a store of value and as a way to build capital, because gold is going to become kind of a target for governments. It already is something that a lot of people think is manipulated, with Western central banks selling their gold secretly on the open market to keep the price down. Because gold going up is the same thing as saying the dollar's going down, and the guys managing these fiat currencies don't want to be made to look bad by gold going up. So they take steps to manage the increase or, actually make it go down. Silver, on the other hand, tends to move along with gold, but it's an industrial metal used in dozens of different really crucial industries out there. And therefore, it can't be just confiscated by the government. It can't be taxed in weird ways where, if your silver goes up in value, the government takes half the profit. You can't do that because so many big industries are using silver. So silver might be freer of the kinds of manipulation that desperate governments engage in, and therefore might go up even relative to gold. It'll go up dramatically relative to dollars and somewhat relative to gold. So it might be the best thing to own. And it's nice and cheap right now. It's had a drop from $50 an ounce to 16 and change today. So I think 5 or 10 years from now, people are going to look back at these prices and wish they'd mortgaged the house and sold the extra car and took their kids out of college and used that money to buy silver. Not that I'm recommending you do any of those things. I'm just saying people are going to wish they did in the future.
Now, as far as what you just described, I mean, what would keep these guys, the governments, from nationalizing silver and saying, well, you have to turn in all your silver because it's already considered a strategic material or a strategic metal? Why wouldn't they take that to the next level and say it has no value and you have to turn it in?
Well, I mean, they could try that, but it would be incredibly complicated because businesses use silver. So what would stop you from incorporating and saying, oh, I'm a silver fabricator, something like that? That would be a big business. Lawyers setting up silver fabrication LLCs for people, because it would just be an easy thing to get around compared to with gold, where they could just say, you know what, like it's 1934 all over again. Turn your gold in. And if you don't turn it in, you get a $10,000 fine and we'll put you in jail, yada, yada. That's simpler because gold isn't used by 1,000 different companies across the country. and bought and sold all the time on exchanges, among and between these companies. So
Right.
it's more complicated. It's not impossible for them to mess with something like silver, but it's way harder. So they would try with gold first, I would imagine. And silver would be the last gasp of a really crazy, desperate government. If they try to start making it illegal to own industrial materials for people, then we've really drifted into fascist twilight zone.
Into the
Yeah,
Neverland.
yeah, because you would need a lot of cops to police
Yes.
silver. So we
Yes,
would
you
have to
would.
create an even bigger police state than we have now. And we would criminalize huge sections of the population and create gigantic black markets.
The black markets, as far as those coming into full view, I mean, because that's what I would see, John. I see that happening really kind of regardless of what happens going forward. I think that as the situation continues to deteriorate further and further, as far as our economy and finances, I see black markets on the horizon. I mean, or am I just completely out of my mind in thinking that?
Well, yeah, as we screw up the economy more and more dramatically, the later stages of this process start to look a little bit like Venezuela, where you've got
Right,
a lot of government intervention in the market and price controls on things, and more and more capital controls on your ability to move money in and out of the country, and how much of one thing you can own versus another thing, and people tend to try to get around stuff like that just because
right.
they're so obviously bad laws. You don't really feel any moral qualms about cheating on your taxes if your tax rate is 78%.
Right,
And the same thing is true in an inflationary economy where there are price controls and capital controls and things like that. You lose respect for the government, therefore
right,
you don't really care if you're a small-time criminal buying stuff out of the trunk of somebody's car, and that's the way it works.
right,
And silver and gold would be very major components of the kinds of black markets that would spring up if we enter that stage. If we enter something akin to hyperinflation and the government starts making a lot of arbitrary, crazy rules, then silver and gold, along with possibly Bitcoin or some other kind of cryptocurrency, would become the stores of value and the mediums of exchange. We would bypass the established financial system, because the established financial system is how the government can track what we're doing. We
right.
don't want them to know what we're doing anymore. And the war on cash is part of this, an early stage part of this process, because governments want to be able to move interest rates below zero. That's how crazy things are. They see a need for long-term negative interest rates out there in the next recession, but they can't do that if there's cash, because we'll just pull our money out of the bank if our bank account is yielding negative 2% or whatever,
Right.
and we'll bypass the banking system. And so that means government monetary policy that's premised on negative interest rates won't work anymore. So a lot of economists are saying, well, we just need to get rid of cash then.
Yeah.
Not, oh, we need to fix our financial policies so we don't need negative interest rates. They're saying, well, let's just get rid of cash so we can have negative interest rates.
Right.
And yeah, and that's out there, probably coming in the next recession. See, things have kind of calmed down a bit right now, where interest rates have stopped falling, and the financial markets don't seem quite as shaky as they were. But that's because we're literally in year 9 of a recovery, which is usually when things seem artificially stable. But all that means is that we've been borrowing more and more money for the last 9 years and spending it. But now we have all this debt. So when the next recession comes, we're even more fragile. We're even more prone to a total breakdown, just meltdown of the global financial system, which will require even more extreme government policies. So I'll go out on a limb and say, within 2 years, we'll be talking negative interest rates in the US, and capital controls, and some sort of price control, and some sort of limitation to ban on cash. We won't necessarily be implementing all of that stuff, but it'll all be on the table. It'll all be open for discussion. And at that point, you're going to want to have a lot of silver coins and gold coins stashed in safe places, because that's the only thing that that will be immune to a lot of this stuff unless they target those things, and in which case then you become part of the black market,
Right.
but you don't want a bank account in that circumstance because it'll yield you nothing and it'll be prone to expropriation. When they start doing bank bail-ins and start vacuuming up checking accounts in order to pay for a bank that goes bust, things like that. And
I mean, that's kind of
so,
what happened in India. I
yeah,
mean, and that it's just unbelievable what's going on there, and the absolute devastation that the citizens had this hand that they've been dealt. It's been forced on them, and
yeah,
they didn't
India
ask
just
for it.
no. Well, India was a little bit of a special case because they were kind of a cash-based economy, which
Yes.
means nobody had to pay taxes. The government wants everybody to pay taxes, so they're trying to financialize the economy. In other words, get everybody to pay their bills with checks and credit cards that can be traced, so you can tell who owes what in taxes. So you can kind of see the government's point, except that um, it represents increasing control of the government over people and lessening of privacy. And it's a shame to see that happen anywhere at any time because we're starting to see it slip away for us here in the U.S.
Yes.
And so it's suddenly an important thing. Financial privacy is almost gone for us because they can track everything now. And I
Yeah.
mean they can record this Skype call and they can turn on your cell phone. Even if you have it off, they can still turn on the mic and they can
Yep.
listen to what you're saying, and then so we don't really have privacy anymore. And cash represents really the last little bit of financial privacy that exists out there for a lot of people. So it represents a lot more than just, a mechanism for the government to figure out who owes what in taxes. It's your privacy, it's your financial privacy. And as we lose other kinds of privacy, the little bit of financial privacy that's left becomes ever more valuable because it's so rare.
Yes, I would agree with that. And the situation in India, I mean, first of all, that nation represents the population represents 1 in 7 people on the entire planet. Second of all, like you said, there was a cash-based economy, and some of the numbers that I've read is between 80 and 90%, somewhere in that range, as far as all of their transactions were cash-based, to the tune of 80 to 90%. And another interesting or more pertinent aspect of what's happening is only about 300 million out of the 1.3 billion people have access to the internet, and less than or somewhere around half the people have bank accounts. You start talking about these are astronomical numbers as far as the impact on this country and on the individual citizens, as far as their ability to just get through the day, and that's it. That I'm talking about being able to have bread, have water, have one piece of comfort brought into their life for the day. Those are all gone because they have no cash. And,
Yeah, that
you know,
that was a pretty extreme case because
well,
literally that was all the money a lot of those people had. And all of a
exactly.
sudden those
It's
big bills that they were saving ceased to have any value. Yeah, that ruined some lives there, and possibly will lead to a regime change in the next election. It's going to be hard to run on the record of having done that if you're the
yes,
guy in charge of India. So, yeah, and China's got a lot of stuff going on that are kind of similar, but not exactly the same thing, but with a similar motivation. They borrowed huge amounts of money over the last 10 years, probably more than any other country has ever borrowed in one 10-year stretch. And a lot of it was misspent and can't be paid back. And now the people who were made rich initially by that are trying to get their money out of the country. So China is imposing lots of different kinds of capital controls on its rich people to keep them from taking their yuan and buying a Vancouver condo or a Miami condo or Los Angeles real estate or something like that, or gold bars in Switzerland, because they're afraid that once that capital flight really gets going, it'll become a stampede and they won't be able to support their currency and their currency will crash. And that's the kind of thing that happens when you borrow way too much money. You start to lose control of the system. And the only way to keep control in the moment is to impose really draconian police state kinds of rules on your people.
Yep.
And then you become something very different. Then you're not that China was ever necessarily a free country, but they were at least a capitalist country from the point of view of guys with money to invest over there. You were able to buy and sell things. And now not so much anymore. So they're becoming a different country. And the US is in the process of the same kind of transition where because we screwed up our finances,
right,
because we borrowed way too much money, the government is forced to do more and more extreme things. And that's changing the nature of the country. We torture people now. We pick people up without a warrant and lock them up, and we kill people with drones from the sky without any kind of due process or anything. And we create currency out of thin air and just toss it out into the world. These are all things that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington would have been appalled by. They wouldn't have accepted that as the normal functioning of the country that they were designing. And this is just the beginning.
The beginning.
Yeah, because, for instance, last year in fiscal 2016, the U.S. government borrowed $1.3 trillion, which is that's just the government borrowing over $1 trillion, not corporations and people taking out car loans and student loans, et cetera, et cetera. The rest of us were borrowing a ton of money too, but the government in year 8 of a recovery still felt the need to borrow over $1 trillion. So we are heading off that cliff at an accelerating rate. We're taking on more and more debt now instead of less and less debt. So we're making things worse, which means that the crazy stuff that the government has done in the last few years in terms of controlling people's behavior and spying on us and everything is only going to be a lot more extreme, which takes us back to the whole central banks buying equities and stuff and industrial policy and everything. That's a 2018 story probably that's going to be even more ominous than it sounds now. It's going to feel crazier at the time when it actually happens than it does in contemplation. So yeah, Roy, we're going to have no shortage of stuff to talk about until they make us stop talking a few years from now.
Well, and that's what I was going to say is that how interesting will this conversation that we're having right now, how will it sound in 2018, 2019, 2020, when more of these draconian, tyrannical, police state, fascist nonsense has been rolled out and shoved down our throat? I mean, it's...
Yeah, there's a pretty good chance that people from the end of this decade listening to this conversation are going to say, wow, those guys were over optimistic. They weren't nearly as worried as they should have been. Because, Trump is just on TV today saying that he hears that torture works really well. So we're going to revive torture.
Torture does not work.
Yeah, well, our president thinks it does now.
Well,
anyhow, that's just a sign of how rapidly things can deteriorate once it really gets going. Once people get really worried and start acting accordingly, and the government has to respond to it.
Yep.
Venezuela, it took them about 10 years to go from a reasonably stable member of OPEC, making lots of money from exporting oil, to flat out bankrupt where they're eating their dogs and their cats,
Yep.
And so it can happen in a hurry. And we've been building the momentum for something like this over 30 years now, where every year we take on more and more debt. And every year we diminish our ability to pay off that debt. So it's coming. Bad stuff is happening, and it will continue to happen. Um, with the only upside being that this kind of crisis creates a lot of opportunity. If you play it right,
Yep.
you can make lots of money while all this is
Yes.
going on. Lots of people got rich during the Great Depression of the 1930s by shorting stocks.
Right.
And
Well, and it's really not even from my perspective, John, it's not really about getting rich, it's about protecting myself. And that's what I want to learn is how to better protect myself, better protect my family, and to hopefully educate people in how they can better protect themselves and their families and their communities. Therefore, we don't just get washed away in this tsunami of the dark ages that are coming. I mean, seriously. I mean,
yeah,
and if you can get rich, then great. But let's start with let's keep the wolves out of the house first.
yeah. Well, I find the possibility of making a ton of money kind of offsets the fear that I feel when I look at a lot of these other trends.
Okay.
So it's a way of maintaining some optimism going into what will probably be a kind of a chaotic time. But the protection angle obviously goes right along with the trying to get rich angle, because they're really the same actions,
Yes.
just with a different goal in mind. But yeah, there's a lot of things that should do well in this kind of an environment from an investment standpoint. Real assets in general. So a nice piece of farmland is always going to have utility, right? If
Always.
it makes food, then very little can happen in the world short of a nuclear war that is going to make that farmland worthless. So that'll hold its value. And energy assets. We're going to need energy going forward. Although I would say a solar farm might be a better thing to own than a coal mine these days, because the technology is in transition of energy.
Yep.
And a well-chosen piece of rental property. For instance, I'm in a college town here in Idaho, and it's pretty stable in terms of real estate because there's always new college kids coming in who need rental properties,
Yep.
need a place to live. And so the people who own little modest rental houses that they rent to college kids have a steady income. And worst comes to worst, they can always move in to a place like that, sell their other house and move into their rental, which has been paid off by the cash flow and everything. So that's something that you can do that will probably give you a good chance of weathering whatever kind of storm comes. So there's stuff you can do, and it's very helpful to. I think psychologically to be focusing on the positive stuff, rearranging your
Yes.
finances so you're going to be in good shape in 5 years is a positive endeavor. It's a good thing to be doing for your mental health.
I
So
would
I think
agree.
that's one way. Because one thing you don't want to do is listen to these gloom and doomy kinds of interviews, like a lot of what you and I just said to each other, and internalize that, and just
And
be
not have a
paralyzed by
solution.
the fear. Yeah. You gotta look at this stuff as an investment thesis,
Right.
basically. In other words, all of this stuff is going on. Yeah, it's dark, but how do I play it? How do I exploit the stuff that's going to happen? And then you've got kind of a positive set of activities you can do going forward, which might have a payoff at the end. And so you're
Yep.
not paralyzed with fear as you look out into this world that's getting darker all the time.
Well, the good news for myself anyway, John, and I'm sure for you as well, from based on what you've just said, is that I just get another coin here and another coin there, and look at other hard good items that I need in order to continue to function better that are outside of what could be dictated to me or not dictated to me. If I've got my own, then I'm in a much better position. If I've got a little bit of solar
Mm-hmm.
energy, then I'm not as dependent upon those wires coming to the house. If I've got a wood burning stove, then I'm not as dependent upon the gas line coming into the house. And I look at these types of situations and how I can, like you said, exploit these things that I can control them, and B, they improve my life, and C, they improve my finances greatly. So these are all very positive aspects that I try to incorporate every single day into my life. And I'm so grateful to speak with you, and I'm so grateful for you to bring that to the table right there. It's the whole highlight of the show for me.
Yeah. It's really important to stress the positive sides of this stuff, because otherwise it's very easy to just hear the crazy side, you know.
A lot of
And
crazy.
there's a lot of good stuff you can do. You know, if we have another 30 seconds, another trend that's really interesting out there that ties into this is the tiny house movement,
Yes.
where people are saying, you know what, I don't need 3,000 square feet in suburbia. I can get by on 300 square feet on this nice little piece of land with a garden beside it and solar panels on top, and be debt free.
Right.
And that right there is something that if you do that, um, you almost guarantee that you'll be okay in the next decade, no matter what happens,
No matter what.
because you can grow a little bit of food on the side. You've got a pleasant space to be in that doesn't cost you much of anything, and you've got electricity from those solar panels. So you're largely self-sufficient. And so what? Let us have 10 years of political chaos and bank stocks crashing and the stock market falling apart, but that's okay, because you will be all right. You and your family will get through it.
Exactly. Well, and we've been speaking with Mr. John Rubino, and you can find all of John's great work over at dollarcollapse.com. And you can also, he's authored 2 different books, and I'll put the links to those books in the description below the video. And John, I certainly appreciate all your time today. This has been great.
Thanks, Roy. Enjoyed it.
Well, we will do this again a lot more sooner than later, and look forward to speaking with you very soon.
Great. Take care.
You too.